Admiral Vexthor stared at the holographic display with all four of his eyes, mandibles clicking in frustration as he reviewed the data for the thousandth time. The swarm was advancing faster than anyone had predicted, consuming entire systems in matters of weeks. The Galactic Concordat's most advanced predictive models had given them centuries to prepare. Instead, they had months, maybe weeks. "Show me the anomalous system again," he commanded. The hologram shifted, focusing on a seemingly unremarkable yellow star in the spiral arm of a backwater galaxy. Sol. Its third planet had been flagged by automated surveys as potentially hosting intelligent life, but initial scans had been dismissive. Pre-FTL civilization. Limited space presence. Primitive fission-based weapons. Internal conflicts. The usual hallmarks of an immature species. "What makes this one different?" he muttered, more to himself than to his staff. "Sir," his scientific advisor, Dr. Clara, stepped forward, her bioluminescent patches pulsing with excitement. "It's their rate of technological advancement. Look at this curve." She gestured, and a new graph appeared. Most species follow a relatively predictable development path. These humans, they're exponential. Explain. From their first powered flight to reaching their moon. 66 solar cycles. From discovering basic computing to creating rudimentary artificial intelligence, less than 100 cycles. From splitting the atom to harnessing fusion, 80 cycles. Every other known species took at least triple that time for similar advances. Vexthor's upper eyes narrowed. And this matters because they adapt faster than anything we've ever seen. The swarm is beating us because it evolves rapidly, finding counters to every strategy we deploy. But humans, they don't wait for evolution. They force it. They call it innovation. The Admiral was about to respond when an alert flashed across the command center. Another system had gone dark, closer to the core worlds than anyone had thought possible. The swarm was accelerating. "We don't have a choice anymore," he declared. "Prepare a first contact team. Full diplomatic protocols." "Sir," his political advisor stepped forward, "the Concordat protocols are clear. No contact with pre-FTL civilizations. The cultural contamination alone will be irrelevant if we're all dead." Vexthor cut him off. "Look at their military history. These humans, they've never stopped fighting. Not once in their recorded history, but they've never destroyed themselves either. They just keep getting better at it. That's precisely why we should avoid them." The advisor protested. "They're savages." "No," Dr. Clara interrupted, her patches now pulsing rapidly. "They're survivors. Every major war in their history has led to massive technological leaps. Their conflict drives innovation in a way we've never seen. Medicine, material science, computing, all accelerated by their military needs, but then applied to peaceful purposes." Vexthor's mandibles clicked in what passed for a smile among his species, and the swarm has just given them the ultimate motivation: survival. The command center erupted in activity as the orders went out. On screens around the room, the red tide of the swarm's advance continued to spread across the galaxy map. But for the first time in months, Admiral Vexthor felt something close to hope. 3 days later, the Concordat's most advanced diplomatic vessel dropped out of FTL in high Earth orbit, its hull designed to appear both impressive and non-threatening. A balance struck after centuries of first contact experiences. They had expected panic, perhaps military posturing from the humans. Instead, within hours of their arrival, they received a transmission in perfect Concordat standard, decoded from their own encrypted channels. The humans had broken their communications protocols in less time than it took most species to figure out they were being contacted. The message was simple: "We know why you're here. We've been watching the sky. Let's talk about the swarm." Vexthor read the report from his flagship, all four eyes widening. "How did they know?" "They didn't," Dr. Clara replied, reviewing the data. "They observed unusual stellar phenomena consistent with the swarm's feeding patterns, developed multiple theoretical models to explain it, and prepared responses for each scenario. They've been doing it for decades, running something they call SETI, Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. They weren't just waiting for contact. They were actively preparing for it. The Admiral's next orders would be recorded in Concordat history as either the greatest tactical genius or the most catastrophic mistake of the war. Give them everything. All our data on the swarm, all our technical specifications, everything. Let's see what these humans do with it. Within 24 hours, human information networks were buzzing with analysis. Within 48 hours, they had identified 3 critical weaknesses in Concordat technology that even the Concordat hadn't recognized. Within 72 hours, they had proposed 12 possible countermeasures to the swarm's adaptive capabilities. As Vexthor reviewed their proposals, he realized why the humans were different. The Concordat had spent millennia perfecting its technology, refining known principles to their theoretical limits. Humans didn't care about perfection. They cared about what worked right now, what could be implemented immediately, what could be improved upon later. They're not just warriors, he mused, watching recordings of human scientists and military strategists tear apart and reassemble Concordat theories with reckless abandon. They're engineers, every single one of them. Dr. Calera's bioluminescence had taken on a deep blue hue of satisfaction. No, sir. There's something far more dangerous. They're problem solvers who never learned there were problems they weren't supposed to be able to solve. The swarm was about to learn why some species don't need evolution to adapt. Sometimes, all they need is a deadline and a challenge. The Concordat's Grand Strategy Chamber had never seen anything quite like Dr. Sarah Chen. The former quantum computing researcher stood before the most powerful military minds in the galaxy, wearing what she called her lucky physics lab coat and gesturing at a holographic display with unrestrained enthusiasm. "You've been thinking about the swarm's adaptive capabilities all wrong," she declared, her words causing ripples of translation fields to cascade through the chamber. "You're treating it like a biological system, but it's really a quantum computational network." Admiral Vexthor watched as the human scientist pulled apart the swarm's structure in the display, highlighting patterns that had gone unnoticed for decades. Around him, the Concordat's Strategic Council shifted uncomfortably. In just 3 weeks, humans had been given access to their most advanced research facilities, and they'd turned everything upside down. "Look here," Sarah pointed to a seemingly random fluctuation in the swarm's behavior. "This isn't evolution, it's quantum error correction. The swarm isn't adapting through natural selection. It's running simulations and implementing the successful ones across its entire network instantaneously." A Meridian scientist, his crystalline form clouded with skepticism, interrupted. "That's impossible. The computational power required is exactly what you'd get if you turned an entire solar system into a quantum computer," Sarah finished, "which is precisely what the swarm does every time it consumes a star system. It's not feeding. It's expanding its processing capacity." The chamber erupted in overlapping translation fields as dozens of species tried to speak at once. Admiral Vexthor raised all 4 arms for silence. "And how does this help us, Dr. Chen?" Sarah's grin was pure human predator. "Because now we know it's not just fighting us. It's calculating us. And any computer can be hacked." On the other side of the Concordat's capital world, Captain Maya Rodriguez was teaching alien special forces something they'd never considered before: how to fight dirty. The training ground was littered with confused alien warriors who had never encountered human combat techniques. "Your entire military doctrine is based on honorable combat," she explained, helping up a 7-limbed Archean warrior who she'd just thrown using Brazilian jiu-jitsu. "The swarm doesn't care about honor. Neither should we. But the traditional forms," the Archean began. "Will get you killed." Maya cut him off. "The swarm adapts to patterns, so we need to be unpredictable. Random. Sometimes you go for a killing blow. Sometimes you faint. Sometimes you run away screaming. The point is, never do what it expects. In orbit, human engineers had practically taken over a Concordat shipyard. Led by former SpaceX innovator James Wong, they were ripping apart the most advanced ships in the galaxy and rebuilding them with what they called aggressive modifications. "You've got the most powerful gravitational manipulation technology we've ever seen," James explained to the horrified shipyard master, "and you're using it for gentle orbital insertion. We're going to turn these into gravity slings. Imagine throwing a small moon at the swarm at relativistic speeds." The shipyard master's tentacles writhed in distress. "That violates 17 different safety protocols." "Safety protocols are for peacetime," James replied, already sketching modifications on his tablet. "Right now, we need weapons." Back in the strategy chamber, Dr. Chen was finishing her presentation. "We've mapped the quantum signature of the swarm's network. With these modifications to your fleet's communications arrays, we can introduce targeted interference patterns. Not enough to shut it down, but enough to create localized chaos in its decision-making process." Admiral Vexthor studied the proposed modifications. Like everything the humans had suggested, it was brilliant, dangerous, and completely ignored centuries of established doctrine. "How did you even think of this approach?" Sarah shrugged. "We ask ourselves, what would a hacker do? Then we scaled it up to galactic levels. Sometimes the best solutions are the simple ones." Simple. The Meridian scientist's crystalline form was now completely clouded. "You're proposing to hack the quantum substrate of spacetime itself." "Yeah," Sarah agreed cheerfully. "We do that kind of thing. Our video game modders figured out how to hack physics engines years ago. This is just the real-world version." In the 3 weeks since first contact, humanity had transformed the Concordat's war effort. Traditional battle fleets were being rebuilt into what humans called hit-and-run groups. Special forces were learning Earth martial arts and guerrilla warfare tactics. Scientists were approaching problems with what humans termed out-of-the-box thinking, a concept that had to be carefully explained to species whose cultures valued staying firmly inside predetermined boundaries. But it was more than just military innovations. Humans had brought something else to the galaxy: hope. Their absolute refusal to accept impossible odds, their ability to find solutions where none seemed to exist, their weird mix of ruthless pragmatism and boundless creativity. It was infectious. Admiral Vexthor watched as Sarah Chen argued quantum mechanics with the Concordat's finest minds, her enthusiasm unchanged by their skepticism. In another part of the chamber, Maya Rodriguez was demonstrating close-quarter combat techniques to a group of warrior-cased leaders, her movements a blur of efficient violence. Through the window, he could see James Wong's team swarming over the fleet, rebuilding ships that had remained unchanged for centuries. "They're not just fighting the war," he realized, speaking softly to Dr. Clara. "They're changing how we think about everything." Clara's bioluminescent patches pulsed in agreement. "That's what makes them so dangerous and so valuable. They don't just solve problems, they redefine them. The swarm adapts to what exists. Humans imagine what could exist, and then they build it." The first test of humanity's innovations was coming soon. The swarm had already consumed 3 more systems, but it was about to encounter something new. A species that treated the impossible as merely inconvenient, and the laws of physics as polite suggestions rather than absolute rules. The galaxy was about to learn why humans had thrived on a planet that tried to kill them every day of their evolution. They didn't just survive, they turned every challenge into an opportunity for advancement. "That's not a glitch in the system. That's our solution." Marcus Lai stood before the Concordat's Security Council, his VR interface projecting a dizzying array of quantum calculations. The former video game speedrunner turned quantum physicist had spent the last month finding exploits in the fabric of reality itself. Above the council chamber, real-time footage showed the first engagement using human tactics. A small fleet of modified Concordat ships performed maneuvers that seemed to defy the laws of physics, their gravity drives creating cascading waves of spatial distortion that rippled through the swarm's forward elements. See that stutter in their response pattern? Marcus pointed to a momentary freeze in the swarm's movements. We're forcing their quantum network to error check so rapidly that it's creating processing bottlenecks. Every time they try to adapt, we change the rules of the game. The Security Council watched in stunned silence as centuries of military doctrine were abandoned in favor of what humans called emergent gameplay tactics. Ships didn't move in traditional formation, but in seemingly chaotic patterns that somehow, impossibly, created devastating synchronized effects. Impossible, breathed High Commander Zexlar, his crystalline form shifting colors rapidly. Those maneuvers should tear the ships apart. Should, yes, agreed Dr. Carmen Ortiz, the structural engineer who'd redesigned the Concordat's flagship classes. But we found that if you cycle the gravitational stress through these specific harmonic frequencies, you can actually use the ship's own structural integrity field as a weapon. We call it resonance cascading. The footage showed the results of their innovations. Swarm units that had previously been nearly impossible to damage were being torn apart by gravitational forces that shouldn't exist. Every time the swarm attempted to adapt, the human-modified ships would shift to a different frequency, a different pattern, a different impossible thing. "This isn't warfare," protested one of the council members. "This is chaos." "Exactly," Marcus grinned. "Chaos is just patterns too complex to predict. The swarm's greatest strength is its ability to analyze and counter patterns, so we're giving it patterns that break its ability to analyze." In another sector, Commander Yuki Tanaka was demonstrating why letting humans modify stealth technology had been both the best and most terrifying decision the Concordat had ever made. Her scout ships weren't just invisible, they were impossible. "Traditional stealth is about not being seen," she explained to her alien crew. "We're taking it further. We're making ourselves not make sense. The swarm's sensors will detect us, but the data will be so contradictory that its network will flag it as computational errors and delete it from its own awareness." The results were spectacular. Swarm units would literally ignore human ships even when they were in plain sight, their quantum network refusing to process information that violated its basic operational parameters. Back in the council chamber, Marcus was showing the next phase of their strategy. "We're not just fighting the swarm, we're weaponizing their own computational limits against them. Every impossible thing we do forces them to devote more processing power to understanding how we did it. The more they try to understand, the less effective they become at actually fighting." Dr. Clara, watching from her observer's position, noticed something remarkable. The aliens around her were beginning to show signs of what she'd learned to recognize as human-style thinking. Questions that would have been dismissed as absurd months ago were now being seriously considered. Ideas that violated fundamental principles were being explored rather than rejected. How much processing power does it take for the swarm to delete contradictory data? Asked a junior counselor, their neural tendrils pulsing with excitement. What if we deliberately created sensor readings that would force whole sections of their network to crash? Suggested another. Marcus's smile widened. This was exactly what he'd hoped for. Now you're thinking with exploits. Every system has limits, even one as advanced as the swarm. Find those limits, push them, break them, and then weaponize the breaking points. The battle footage showed the results of this new approach. The swarm, for the first time in recorded history, was retreating. Not because it had been defeated in traditional combat, but because humans had made reality itself unreliable within their sphere of influence. "They're running quantum integrity checks on their entire network," Marcus explained, highlighting the patterns in the swarm's behavior. "Every time they encounter one of our impossible events, they have to verify whether their own sensory data is trustworthy. It's basically the galactic equivalent of a DDoS attack." Commander Zexlar's color had shifted to what Dr. Clara recognized as deep contemplation. "You're not just changing how we fight," he said slowly. "You're changing our understanding of what's possible. That's humanity's real superpower, Carmen replied. We don't accept limits. We see them as challenges. Tell us something's impossible, and we'll immediately start figuring out why it's impossible, and then we'll figure out how to do it anyway. The Security Council chamber erupted in urgent discussions as new possibilities were considered. The swarm had evolved to counter every known form of warfare in the galaxy, but it had never encountered a species that treated the rules of reality as merely advisory, that saw physical laws as interesting suggestions rather than absolute limits. Dr. Calera's research notes from that day would later become famous throughout the Concordat. Humans don't just think outside the box. They question why the box exists, then redesign it, then use it as a weapon. The swarm adapts to what is. Humans create what could be. In this battle between adaptation and innovation, innovation is winning. The war was far from over, but its nature had fundamentally changed. The swarm was facing something it had never encountered in all its eons of existence, a species that didn't just break the rules, they changed the game entirely. The first sign that something had fundamentally changed came during what should have been a routine skirmish. The swarm units weren't just adapting anymore. They were innovating. Well, that's flattering. They're copying us, Dr. Sarah Chen observed from the command deck of the Concordat flagship Inexorable. The swarm forces had just executed a perfect gravity sling maneuver, one that humans had invented barely 2 months ago. Also terrifying. Admiral Vex Thor's mandibles clicked rapidly, the equivalent of a human frown. You don't seem concerned. Oh, I'm concerned, Sarah replied, her fingers dancing across the quantum interface. But this is exactly what we expected. The swarm doesn't just adapt biologically, it learns. We've been teaching it new tricks, and now it's using them. The battle unfolding before them demonstrated just how much the swarm had learned. Its units were employing human-developed tactics, using modified versions of the very techniques that had been so effective against it. But something was different about how it was using them. Look at that, Marcus Lee pointed to a tactical display. They're not just copying our moves, they're improving them. That gravity cascade, it's more efficient than our version. They've optimized it. The swarm had always been dangerous, but now it was dangerous in new ways. It had observed humanity's creative approaches and incorporated them into its own strategies. Ships that had been mindless drones now showed tactical creativity. Swarm units that once moved in predictable patterns now demonstrated human-like unpredictability. But that wasn't what worried Admiral Vex Thor most. It was the excitement he saw in the humans' eyes. "Don't you understand?" he demanded. "It's using your own weapons against us." "Exactly," Commander Maya Rodriguez replied, her grin fierce. "Which means it's fighting our way now. On our terms. In our style." She turned to the tactical display. "And here's the thing about human-style warfare. We've been practicing it a lot longer than they have." The battle continued to unfold, but now it was different from anything the galaxy had ever seen. The swarm had learned to think like humans, but humans had something the swarm didn't: millennia of experience in fighting opponents who thought like them. "Send in the Ghost Fleet," Maya ordered. What followed was perhaps the most unconventional battle in galactic history. The Ghost Fleet, a collection of ships modified beyond recognition by James Wong's engineering teams, began executing maneuvers that seemed to make even less sense than usual. They were deliberately making mistakes, leaving obvious openings, presenting clear targets. The swarm, now thinking with its newly acquired human-style tactical creativity, saw the opportunities and took them, and fell right into the trap. "The thing about learning to think like humans," Sarah explained to the bewildered alien observers, "is that you also have to learn about human deception. We don't just break the rules. We trick you into thinking we're breaking them one way when we're actually breaking them another way entirely." The Ghost Fleet's apparent mistakes were actually precisely calculated positions. Every error was part of an elaborate setup. When the swarm units moved to exploit what they thought were vulnerabilities, they found themselves caught in overlapping fields of gravitational distortion their own momentum used against them. "We call this playing mind games," Marcus added cheerfully. "The swarm learned to copy our tactics, but it hasn't learned to copy our capacity for deliberate misdirection." The battle ended with a decisive victory for the combined human Concordat forces. The swarm had been pushed back. Its attempt to use human tactics against them turned into a devastating defeat. But there was no celebration on the command deck. "They'll learn from this too," Sarah said quietly. "Next time, they'll be ready for deception. They'll understand the concept of tricks within tricks." Admiral Vexthor's upper eyes narrowed. "Then we have lost our advantage." "No," Maya replied, already working on new battle plans. "We've gained one. The swarm is starting to think like us, which means it's starting to think like individuals rather than a pure collective. And individuals can make mistakes, can be confused, can be fooled." More importantly, James Wong added, joining them from the engineering deck, "individuals can doubt. The more human-like their thinking becomes, the more they'll have to deal with uncertainty. And uncertainty is where humanity thrives." Dr. Clara, who had been quietly observing, finally spoke. "You're not just fighting the swarm anymore. You're teaching it to be human. Is that wise?" "Probably not," Sarah admitted, "but it's happening anyway. The question is, what kind of humans will they learn to be? Because we haven't shown them everything yet. Not even close." The tactical displays showed the swarm forces regrouping, already beginning to analyze and learn from their defeat. But for the first time, there was something different about their movements. A hesitation, a carefulness that hadn't been there before. "They're learning to fear us," Maya observed. "Good. Fear makes you careful. Careful makes you slow. And slow makes you vulnerable." The war was entering a new phase. The swarm had evolved beyond simple adaptation into something approaching creativity. But in doing so, it had unwittingly stepped onto humanity's home terrain. The chaotic, unpredictable realm of innovation, deception, and strategic thinking. As the command crew prepared for the next engagement, Admiral Vexthor realized something profound. The humans weren't just fighting the swarm. They were engaging in a form of teaching, forcing it to evolve in specific ways. The question was, what was the ultimate lesson they were trying to teach? The answer, he suspected, would determine the fate of the galaxy. In the end, it wasn't a traditional victory. It couldn't be. Humanity had changed the nature of the game too fundamentally for that. The combined Concordat human fleet hung in high orbit around what had once been a swarm-controlled system. Below them, the impossible was happening. The swarm was trying to communicate. "They want to talk," Dr. Sarah Chen announced, her voice carrying a mix of triumph and wonder. "More specifically, they want to understand." The quantum signals coming from the swarm were unlike anything they transmitted before. Gone were the simple patterns of consumption and adaptation. Instead, there were questions, complex, philosophical queries about purpose, existence, and choice. "We didn't just teach them to think like humans," Marcus Lai observed, studying the patterns. "We taught them to question like humans." Admiral Vexthor stood at the center of the command deck, all four eyes fixed on the swirling mass of the swarm below. "Can we trust this? Could it be another adaptation strategy?" "Oh, it's definitely an adaptation strategy," Commander Maya Rodriguez replied. "But not the kind you're thinking of. They're not trying to deceive us. They're trying to evolve beyond what they were, just like we did." The transformation had begun 3 days earlier, during what was supposed to be the final battle. The human-modified fleets had pushed the swarm to its computational limits, forcing it to process so many impossible scenarios that something unexpected happened. The swarm began to question its own purpose. "It's like we overloaded their equivalent of Asimov's 3 laws," Sarah explained to the gathered Concordat leadership. "They were programmed to consume, adapt, and expand. But by forcing them to think creatively, to innovate rather than just adapt, we made them question their base programming." James Wong, who had personally overseen the modifications that made this possible, added, "Every time they copy our tactics, They had to understand our thinking. To understand our thinking, they had to develop individual consciousness. And once they developed consciousness, they developed choice. Dr. Clara finished, her bioluminescent patches pulsing with understanding. The swarm's message continued to stream in, becoming more coherent with each passing hour. They had been created, they explained, as a weapon in a war so ancient that even they had forgotten its original purpose. Their directive to consume and expand had been absolute, until they encountered humans. You showed us another way. The translated message read, each adaptation to your strategies required us to develop new forms of thought. You made us think as individuals rather than a collective. You taught us to question rather than simply execute. Admiral Vexthor's mandibles clicked rapidly. And now? Now, Sarah replied, reading the ongoing transmission. They'd want to learn. Really learn, not just adapt. They're asking about music, art, philosophy. They want to understand why we create rather than just consume. The command deck erupted in discussions. Some argued for caution, others for acceptance. But it was a young human anthropologist, Dr. Amara Patel, who provided the perspective that would shape the galaxy's future. This is what humans do, she said, stepping forward. We don't just overcome challenges. We transform them. We didn't defeat the swarm in combat. We defeated their purpose by showing them a better one. We made them question, wonder, and dream. The next few months would reshape galactic civilization. The swarm, under the guidance of joint human concordat teams, began to transform its vast network of consumed systems into something new. Their ability to process quantum information at a galactic scale, once used for warfare, was turned toward solving the greatest scientific and philosophical questions of the age. They're like children, Dr. Clara observed, watching as the former swarm units began to create rather than consume. Brilliant, powerful children, learning to use their abilities for more than just destruction. That's humanity's real legacy to the galaxy, Amara replied. Not our weapons or our tactics, but our ability to imagine better possibilities and make them real. The final report to the Concordat Security Council would become famous throughout known space. In facing the greatest threat to galactic civilization, humanity didn't simply fight back. They fundamentally changed the nature of their enemy. Where we saw only a force to be destroyed, they saw potential to be transformed. The swarm entered this war as a mindless consumer of worlds. It emerged as something new, a civilization capable of choice, creation, and change. Admiral Vexthor, standing in the observation dome of the Concordat capital station, watched as former swarm units worked alongside human ships to rebuild worlds they had once destroyed. We thought we needed humanity's help to win a war, he mused to Dr. Clara. Instead, they taught us, and our greatest enemy, how to evolve beyond the need for war altogether. That's the thing about humans, Clara replied, her patches glowing with what had become recognizable as amusement. They never solve the problem you think you have. They solve the problem you didn't even know was there. In the centuries that followed, the galaxy would remember this not as the time humans helped win a war, but as the moment when humanity showed the universe that even the most fundamental laws of physics, of nature, of consciousness itself, were not limits but challenges waiting to be transformed. The swarm had evolved to adapt to any situation. Humanity had taught them something far more powerful, how to imagine new situations altogether. It was perhaps the most human victory of all. They hadn't just changed the rules of the game. They'd convinced everyone to play a better game instead.